السلام علیکم ناظرین، کشمیر سوشل ریویو کے ایک اور پروگرام کے ساتھ حاضر ہیں۔ آج کا ہمارا پروگرام انتہائی امپورٹنٹ پروگرام ہے۔ ہمارے ساتھ ایک ینگ اور انرجیٹک پی ایچ ڈی اسکالر ہیں، ڈاکٹر رابعہ خان، یونیورسٹی آف لنڈن سویس سے انہوں نے پی ایچ ڈی کی ہے سوشل سائنسز میں، اور پرٹیکولرلی مائنارٹیز اور فردر پرٹیکولرلی ہزارہ کمیونٹی کے اوپر ان کی ریسرچ ہے۔ ان کا تعلق پونچھ جموں کشمیر سے ہے۔ ان کے ساتھ شامل ہوں گے ڈاکٹر دانش، جو فرینکلن اینڈ مارشل کالج میں پروفیسر ہیں۔ آپ دونوں حضرات کا پروگرام میں خوش آمدید۔ ڈاکٹر رابعہ، اگر آپ سے شروع کیا جائے، آئی نو کہ آپ کو شاید اردو میں پرابلم ہو، تو آپ انگلش میں اپنے جوابات دے سکتی ہیں، لیکن ہمارے ناظرین کے لیے ہمارا جو پلیٹ فارم ہے، ہم پورے ساؤتھ ایشیا میں اردو اسپیکنگ جتنے بھی لوگ ہیں ان کو کور کرنا چاہتے ہیں، تو اٹس اپ ٹو یو کہ آپ کے لیے جو بھی کنوینئنٹ میڈیم ہے آپ اس کو یوز کر سکتی ہیں۔ اگر ہم آپ سے سٹارٹ کریں تو آپ کا جو پرٹیکولر جو پی ایچ ڈی جو آپ کی ریسرچ ہے وہ ہزارہ کمیونٹی کے اوپر ہے، تو یہ بڑا ایک سینسیٹیو ٹاپک ہے اور بہت کم لوگ ہیں، اور پھر جس طرح آپ کا تعلق پونچھ سے ہے، آپ رہتی آپ لنڈن میں ہیں، تو کس طریقے سے آپ نے پی ایچ ڈی کا سوچا کہ آپ کو ہزارہ کمیونٹی کے اوپر پی ایچ ڈی کرنا چاہیے؟ اور تھوڑا سا ہمیں بتائیں، آپ اپنی اس ہزارہ کمیونٹی کے حوالے سے ہمیں بتائیں کہ یہ اس کے اوپر آپ کا یہ جو خیال آیا ہے، اگر میں اس کو تھوڑا سا جنریٹ کروں اس سوسائٹی کے ساتھ، تو ابھی میں تھوڑی دیر پہلے پڑھ رہا تھا کہ جو اس سال جو ورلڈ ہزارہ جینوسائیڈ میموریل ڈے بھی بنایا جاتا ہے، کہ جب جو افغان امیر تھے عبد الرحمان، انہوں نے 60% پاپولیشن جو جینوسائیڈ کر دی تھی، اور یہ اس کا آبزرونس ڈے بنایا جاتا ہے۔ اور کچھ اسٹیٹسٹکس ہیں 2014، 15، 16، 17 اور 18 کے، جن میں 14 میں 2865 جو ہزارہ تھے وہ کل ہوئے ہیں، 15 میں 2682، 17 میں 2666 اینڈ 28 میں 2798۔ ایک بڑے پیمانے پہ جینوسائیڈ کیا جا رہا ہے۔ اس طرح لگتا ہے کہ ٹارگیٹڈ کلنگ ہے پورے سیٹ کا۔ اور میں یہ بھی بتاتا چلوں کہ ہزارہ جو افغان پاپولیشن ہے اس کا 20% ہے، تو اتنی بڑی پاپولیشن کو کیوں مارجنلائز کیا جا رہا ہے؟
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question. I apologize. I will be answering in English if that's okay. So in relation to the first part of your question, how I came to work on this topic, it was mostly a self-study. So it started about 10 years ago. I was an undergraduate student in law, and we studied international law. So we looked at what was happening in Iraq, the war in Iraq. In my classes, Afghanistan was very understudied. We didn't really know about the war in Afghanistan and what was happening there. So it was kind of through those interactions and being in those intellectual spaces, but not having much of an opportunity to learn about Afghanistan, I took it upon myself to read more about the war in Afghanistan outside of the classroom. And it was reading books and journal articles about the country that I came to learn about the ethnic diversity in Afghanistan, which I found very fascinating. I didn't know anything about the country at the time. So I learned about the different ethnic communities such as Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek. And within that, I came to learn about the specific Shia community in Afghanistan, the Hazaras. So I didn't really know about the religious diversity of Afghanistan. So I was very intrigued to learn specifically about this ethnic community called Hazaras, who were also seen to be Shia Muslim in a country where most people are Sunni Muslim. So it was through that I learned more about the Hazara community. And even at that time, sadly, there was very little academic work on Hazara communities in English. And over the years, even speaking with Hazara friends, I've learned that the native language of Hazaras, Persian, it's the same problem in the Persian language, that there's limited academic work about the Hazara community. So that was kind of the early stages, but it was very much to just educate myself. So I went to a few demonstrations and community events in London to meet community members and learn about the Hazara community myself. And then those interactions and friendships kind of developed over several years. And then as a result of that, I came to the decision that I would like to do a specific research project with Hazaras living in the UK. But that hadn't been the intention in the beginning. So then as a result of that, I did my PhD research focusing on the Hazara community, and I looked specifically at this term that's known as ethnic consciousness. So I was looking at ethnic consciousness among Hazaras, and the kind of most simple way to understand ethnic consciousness, it means when a person has a like a sense of belonging with a particular ethnic community. So I was looking at this idea in relation to Hazaras to see how they associate with their Hazara community and how they understand their identity as Hazaras. Because one thing you mentioned was the king in the late 1800s. So Abdul Rahman Khan, he was a Sunni king, and he engaged in a really severe and suppressive war against the Hazaras. And according to Hazara oral history, that resulted in 60% to 65% of the community being massacred. So since that time, Hazaras have been really at the bottom of the country's social hierarchy, so for over a century. But that changed slightly in the, not slightly, quite a bit actually, in the 1990s and post 2001. There was quite a significant political shift among Hazaras. So I basically trace Hazara ethnic consciousness in relation to the historic circumstances of Hazaras and the more recent kind of political gains and community visibility that has happened since the late 1990s and early 2000s. And yes, your point about the kind of number of civilian casualties. So the statistics vary depending on which resource you're using and which source you're looking at to acquire the information. But yes, so there was obviously what's now being referred to by the Hazara community as a genocide in the late 1800s by the king. For a long time, that wasn't really referred to as a genocide, but because of the intent, motive, and the fact that the king had explicitly said that the war was against the Hazaras, it's being referred to as a genocide more in recent years. And in the last few years as well, there's been many targeted attacks against Hazaras in Kabul. So the kind of official claim is that ISIS are behind these attacks against Hazaras, and the reason, part of the reason, is the religious element. So some of your viewers may know, but others may not know, that Hazaras are predominantly Shia Muslim, whereas most of Afghanistan's other ethnic communities are Sunni. So religion is very much utilized to justify the suppression and violence against Hazaras in the last few years. But also there is a kind of feeling that sometimes the Taliban might be behind these attacks, and it's very convenient for the Taliban to blame another group, so that the Taliban can say that we've changed and we're not like the Taliban in the 1990s. So yeah, so you have kind of competing narratives about the motivation behind the attacks and who's targeting the Hazaras. But in the last few years, there's been a severe increase in the number of targeted attacks against Hazaras in Afghanistan. And yeah, the reasoning is tied to religion, but also ethnicity, because of the historic marginalization of Hazaras and the belief that they're kind of like an external ethnic community that came and settled in Afghanistan, because for a very long time there was this belief that Hazaras maybe came from Mongolia to Afghanistan. This is somewhat disputed now, although most people believe that there is some kind of Turkic-Mongol heritage connection. But yeah, so this perception of Hazaras being outsiders and not native to Afghanistan has also been a reason that they've been very suppressed for over a century and even the last couple of decades. So it's those two kind of ethnic and religious components that have caused the community to really be very treated very badly in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Rabia. This is really fascinating. It seems like your research is really community driven and based on the political and sociological struggles of the Hazara community. From an academic lens, I'm curious to see, you talk about the ethnic consciousness among Hazara. So how do they conceptualize themselves? Because it seems like there's an intersectionality of religion and ethnicity. Yeah. So is it primarily through religious lens or ethnic lens?
Yeah, that's a really brilliant question. So like a lot of my questions were very, very open-ended in my interviews that I had. So I worked with Hazaras who were living in the UK, but they'd all migrated from Afghanistan, Iran and Pakistan. So their connection was to Central South Asia region. So yeah, this was very fascinating for me because the academic literature very much makes the case of Hazaras being a distinct ethnic community based on their language, the claim of being, Turkic Mongol or Mongol. So that's kind of what's kind of established and available in the literature. And then some of that literature also makes a strong connection to the Shia identity as Shia Muslims for the Hazaras. But actually, when you speak to people, it's very, very diverse. Like obviously, we're trying to understand this understanding from the community themselves. So for some people, they would make a very strong connection to like a cultural, linguistic, ethnic identity when they were explaining what it means to be Hazara. But for other people, it was very much about values and ideals. Like when I spoke to some Hazaras, they would say, you know, what it means to be Hazara is to be someone who supports democracy, women's rights, education. So for me, that was a really interesting and new dimension to conceptualizing Hazara identity, because in the academic literature, it's not written about in this way at all. So it was framing identity in a totally new way, relating it to people's personal values. And then the religious component, again, that really varies. Like some people I spoke to, they said that, you know, when you say Hazara, it automatically means Shia, or if we think about Shia in the context of Afghanistan, it means Hazara. But you did have kind of much more nuance presented in the interviews than I found in the available literature. So some of even my very religious research participants, they would say, you know, I'm proudly Muslim, I'm proudly Shia, but my religious identity is very distinct from my ethnic identity or my Hazara identity. And what was very common in those conversations was for people to say, you know, you choose your religion. Obviously, most people were born into the faith that they were practicing, but they could still leave it or choose another faith if they wanted to. Whereas to be Hazara, it's something that they were born with and they will die as a Hazara. So what was very fascinating to me was where across the religious spectrum, people who were secular, or even if they were very religious, generally there was a divide made between categorizing religion with identity as a joint ethno-religious identity. And what was very important to research participants was to separate the two and say, Shia is a distinct category and Hazara is a distinct category. And within that, what was quite interesting to me was to emphasize the religious diversity among Hazaras. A lot of people would say that if you say Shia Hazara or Hazara Shia, you exclude the wider Hazara community. And what's meant by that is, for example, the lesser studied and lesser known Hazara communities who are also Sunni and Ismaili. So we know even less about them. So to understand Hazara identity through a religious prism excludes other Hazara community members such as Sunni and Ismaili Hazaras.
This is a really wonderful work, so thank you for taking up such questions. And we interpret a lot of work what you have done in the context of Hazara. It seems like it's relevant in the context of Jammu and Kashmir. If I go back to Waleed, wahan pe bhi religious diversity is massive. So Waleed, I mean, in terms of your own experiences, aapne Jammu and Kashmir mein as an activist bhi kaam kiya. So ये जो religious based movement जो कश्मीर में भी introduce कराई गई, despite the fact कि वहाँ पे ethnic and religious diversity है, तो आप कैसे इसको समझते हैं कि कैसे जो इतनी diverse समाज हैं जहाँ पे religious और ethnic diversity उनको कैसे unify किया जा सकता है?
बहुत शुक्रिया दानिश। अगर जम्मू कश्मीर की हम हिस्ट्री देखें तो वो एक डाइवर्स, जिस तरह आपने कहा, डाइवर्स एक एरिया है। वहाँ पे शिया भी हैं, सुन्नी भी हैं और बाकी रिलीजियस के लोग भी हैं। जिस तरह अगर हम जम्मू में देखें तो वहाँ पे 60% मुस्लिम हैं और बाकी 40% जो हैं वो नॉन मुस्लिम हैं, जिनमें पंडित भी हैं, हिंदू भी हैं, सिख भी हैं। अगर आप जम्मू में देखें तो आपको वहाँ पे 60% आपको गैर मुस्लिम मिलेंगे, जिनमें मेजॉरिटी जो है वो हिंदू भी हैं और बुद्धिस्ट भी हैं। और शायद एक दुनिया में बहुत ही कम, शायद पूरे जम्मू कश्मीर में 1 या 2 घर हैं जिसको बाय रिलीजन कहते हैं, वो भी गिलगित बल्तिस्तान में हैं। तो अगर हम इनकी डेमोग्राफी देखें तो जो आज़ाद कश्मीर का रीजन है, यहाँ पे मेनली जो है वो मुस्लिम मेजॉरिटी ज़्यादा है और सुन्नी मुस्लिम मेजॉरिटी ज़्यादा है। कुछ प्रोविंसेस जो कुछ डिस्ट्रिक्ट ऐसे हैं जिनमें शिया पॉपुलेशन भी है, जिनमें मुजफ्फराबाद, बाग का कुछ हिस्सा, अब्बासपुर, फिर कुटली की साइड पे वहाँ पे शिया हमारे ब्रदर्स भी मौजूद हैं। इसी तरह अगर श्रीनगर पे जाएं तो 60% वहाँ पे मुस्लिम हैं, 40% वहाँ पे पंडित, गैर मुस्लिम जो हैं पंडित उनमें हैं, हिंदू भी हैं, वहाँ पे सिख भी हैं। अगर आप जम्मू में जाएं तो 60% वहाँ पे गैर मुस्लिम हैं, जिनमें अगेन हिंदू, और 40% बाकी माइनॉरिटीज हैं। अगर आप लद्दाख में जाएं तो लद्दाख के 2 बेसिकली जो उनके डिस्ट्रिक्ट हैं, लेह जिसको कहते हैं, उसमें 95% बुद्धिस्ट हैं और कारगिल में 95% मुस्लिम हैं। और अगर आप जो गिलगित बल्तिस्तान में जाएं तो गिलगित बल्तिस्तान में मेजॉरिटी जो है वो सिटी में जो है वो सुन्नी और शिया मिक्स हैं। उनके बाकी जो प्रोविंसेस हैं वहाँ पे मेजॉरिटी किसी उनके जो सूबा है, सॉरी सूबा नहीं, जिला जो है उनका डिस्ट्रिक्ट, उसमें शिया की पॉपुलेशन ज्यादा है और कुछ में जो है वो सुन्नी की पॉपुलेशन ज्यादा है। और गिलगित बल्तिस्तान में आपको पता है इस्माइली शिया वहाँ पे हैं, खास करके हजारा में। और मैंने जिस तरह आपसे बात की है कि वहाँ पे बाहर रिलीजन के लोग भी हैं, तो इस तरह के छोटे छोटे जो एक या दो घर टोटल रह गए हैं पूरी दुनिया में, इस तरह के लोग भी वहां पे हैं। तो हिस्टोरिकली ये एक डाइवर्स किस्म की एक रीजन था जिसमें सारे लोग बड़ी आपस में मिलजुल के रहते थे। लेकिन यहाँ पे इस तरीके से जब आपको पता है कहीं पे भी जब ऑक्यूपेशन आता है तो इन चीजों को वहां पे ज्यादा हाईलाइट किया जाता है, इस तरह के डिवीजन को ज्यादा एनगल्फ किया जाता है, बढ़ाया जाता है लोगों के दरमियान। और कोशिश की जाती है कि इस तरह के इश्यूज क्रिएट किए जाएं कि जो इस तरह ब्रदरहुड को छोड़ के वो लोगों की डिवीजन और लोगों के आपस में तजादात की बुनियाद पे उनको आपस में लड़ाया जाए। तो एक तो जो कि अगर 1947 से अगर आप पहले देखें तो वहां पे एथनिसिटी के बुनियाद पे, वहां पे सेक्ट की बुनियाद पे किलिंग बहुत कम होती थी या डिवीजन बहुत कम होती थी। 47 के बाद ये जो इस तरह की जो वेव आई है वो बहुत ज्यादा है। और फिर पर्टिकुलरली जब 1980s के बाद जब एक मिलिटेंट वार स्टार्ट हुई है, और खास करके उसको टारगेट उसका वो था श्रीनगर था। और तो उसके नतीजे में जो इस तरह की एक्सट्रीमिज्म था इसको परवान चढ़ाया गया। वहां पे मुख्तलिफ एक्सट्रीमिस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन बिल्डअप की गई, जहाद की बुनियाद पे वहां पे डिक्लेयर किया गया कि बाकी जो गैर मुस्लिम हैं हमें उन्हें कत्ल कर देना चाहिए। अगेन इसके पीछे बहुत सारी थेरीज थी, बहुत सारी रीजंस थी। तो अगर हमने एक तो हमारे साथ अलमिया ये है कि हमारा रीजन जो है वो प्रैक्टिकली 3 हिस्सों में तकसीम है। फिर वहां पे कोई भी हम मेजॉरिटी को किसी सेक्ट को नहीं कह सकते। अगेन अगर हम कहते हैं कि वो मुस्लिम स्टेट है तो मुस्लिम में इटसेल्फ वो शिया और सुन्नी में डिवाइड है, तो जो आपस में कंप्लीटली एक दूसरे के साथ मिलने के लिए तैयार नहीं है। तो अगर हमने इस सारे रीजन को जोड़ना है तो हमें एक न्यू सोशियो पॉलिटिकल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट करना पड़ेगा जिसमें
इसी पॉइंट पे अगर इफ यू अलाउ मी, दिस इज अ गुड पॉइंट, सो आई टेक बैक टू डिस्कशन टू राबिया टू सी कि वो कैसे इसको समझती हैं। सो given this diversity, and again, we all have a common connection in that with Jammu and Kashmir. So putting on your scholarly hat, you see the Jammu and Kashmir is highly diverse across ethnic and religious lines. Similarly, Hazara folks from Hazara community spread in Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, again, they live in highly diverse societies. So how can we minimize conflict, right, across these religious ethnic lines and create what Waleed said, a new socio-political contract through which we can have an inclusive society where folks, whatever religion they have equal rights and can practice their faith and religion freely?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, obviously Waleed gave us a very comprehensive kind of background information about the diversity of the region. And I'm not sure if it's my place to really speak as someone from the diaspora who doesn't really have much lived experience there. But in terms of interactions I've had and what I've learned over the years, I think one thing that that's really appealed to me about the wider region, our region, is that it's so ethnically and religiously diverse. I see that as such a beautiful thing that we have this diversity. But unfortunately, the fragmentation has meant that it's not something we always appreciate. So I think what was just mentioned in the previous point is really important, is the need to educate and learn, actually, because a lot of these divisions have started after partition. Like there's so many pre-partition stories about interreligious communities living amongst each other, protecting each other's places of worship, looking out for each other, having very strong bonds and connections to one another. So this isn't something that's alien to our region. It's something historically embedded in our communities and has existed for such a long time. But it's the politicization of the religion and the fact that it's a very tense kind of current situation in terms of the military presence and the militancy that's really changed the way things are framed and understood in the region. So for me, as someone from the diaspora, the need to educate myself about the different communities that live in our wider region beyond the community I come from, I would say that's a really important thing. And yeah, that would be the first area. I feel education is the most important thing, because we become so distant and disconnected from one another, whereas historically we were so interconnected. And just when I think back to my own family, like my granddad who grew up in Punch, speaks so fondly about his school teachers who were Hindu. And, this is such an alien concept towards the newer generations because, partition reconfigurated the region and the different communities living there. So to kind of humanize the communities that we see as the other and that we're very afraid of. And actually, these are, in a way, I would even say external narratives that have been propagated towards our people about the fear of the other and kind of like this tendency towards extremism, when the history of our region shows that we were very we had very peaceful and cohesive relations between ethnic communities and religion. So I would say education is very much the kind of first area we would need to focus on. And in the diaspora it's much easier because we have much more access to information. We don't have the problems that people have with the internet and accessing certain books and things like that. So that's very much something in the diaspora I feel we don't have as much excuses to really educate ourselves in that regard.
I agree, especially in the context of Jammu and Kashmir, what you just said, that कि आपके दादा के हिंदू टीचर्स पढ़ाते थे पुंछ रावलाकोट के इलाके में। अभी शायद आप किसी नौजवान से भी ये बात करें रावलाकोट में, तो उनके लिए ये अनहोनी बात होगी। Of course, mazhab, religion is a really important part of identity for folks in Jammu and Kashmir, but it's not the only one, right? And everyone should be allowed to practice whatever faith or whatever way they identify themselves. That should be guaranteed. Now, going back to what you earlier mentioned about being a person living overseas as a diaspora, from perspective of Jammu and Kashmir, but also while studying Hazara community, I mean, one obvious question would be the question of positionality, how you, being not Hazara, can maybe speak for them, right? So how you address that issue?
Yeah, so I think from the get-go, in the UK we call it thesis, so you guys would call it dissertation. So what we write for our PhD, it's acknowledged from the get-go that the information I'm sharing comes directly from the research participants. I'm not integrating any of my perspectives. I'm letting the interviewee speak. So it's just a case of where I come to it is framing it in certain topics and areas of understanding, as opposed to speaking above the people who, spoke to me within my research. But in terms of, the issue of positionality. So one thing that was really striking to me was, so I was kind of quite nervous getting towards the end of the first year of my PhD, because in the UK context, the second year is where you start conducting your research interviews and field work. So, the issue of being someone from outside didn't really hit me early on in the research. I was just so interested in kind of reading and learning. And then when it came to the interview data collection, then it kind of dawned on me that, I am coming from this as someone from outside. So I did speak to people from within the community for a couple of months before I started started my interviews. And one thing that came as a surprise to me, as someone who's not Hazara, someone who's not Afghan and doesn't come from a Shia background, I was worried about the level of kind of trust or how comfortable people would feel speaking to me. And what was quite surprising for me was in the vast majority of my conversations, I was told that the fact that anyone from outside actually is taking an interest and wants to speak and learn, wants to learn and write, it is in itself something that will make you much more create like a bond between you and the community, even though you are from outside. So what was interesting to me in my interactions was it was said to me on multiple occasions that Hazaras are so understudied and unknown community, unfortunately, so that anyone from outside that's kind of reaching out and kind of willing to learn and get educated, they'll be quite warmly received. And so in those interactions, that was just something that was communicated to me verbally, but that was my experience the whole time. So I spent 12 months doing research interviews, and obviously it's just a fact of life that not everybody you reach out to necessarily wants to be interviewed or has the time or interest, but the vast majority of times people were very receptive and open and willing to put me in touch with other people even after they'd been interviewed and things like that. So that issue of being an outsider, as far as I understand, didn't negatively impact the research in and of itself, because the vast majority of community members and research participants seem to be just happy, for lack of a better term, that this is being written about. Like it's about time that this is discussed, and people come to learn about the historic and current injustices. So yeah, in that sense, my kind of apprehensions were, in the end, they very much faded because everyone was very receptive and helpful throughout the research process.
या जो काबुल है वो एक दफ़ा फिर अफगान जो तालिबान हैं 2 दहाइयों के बाद उनके कब्जे में है एंड there was 10,000 Taliban who were killed in Mazar Sharif in their last regime. उनका अब 20 साल के बाद अफगानिस्तान पे तालिबान की फिर हुकूमत है तो जो तालिबान है वो हजारा को अच्छा एक तो वो चूंकि ऑर्थोडॉक्स रिलीजियस हैं तो किस तरीके से वो हजारा को इस दफा देखते हैं या हजारा के साथ उनकी जो ट्रीटमेंट है वो किस नेचर की है
Yeah, so unfortunately the history of the Taliban with the Hazaras is very negative. So some of your viewers may know that obviously 2021 was when the Taliban came in power again, but they were also in power during the 1990s. So from 1996 to 2001, the country was ruled by the Taliban, and that was the first time they controlled most of the territory in the country. So in that time, there was a lot of hostility towards Hazaras, again coming to this understanding that Hazaras are Shia. And from their extremist ideological perspectives, the Taliban believe that, Hazaras are not true Muslim. They don't follow the true Islam. So that was the major issue there. So and this goes beyond, even Sunnis who are willing to stand up to the Taliban are going to be seen as problematic. So unfortunately, for someone to proclaim Shia identity made them very, very vulnerable during that time. So one of the most well-known cases was a commander, Taliban commander in the north. His name was Mullah Niazi. So in the late 1990s, he declared that Hazaras must convert to Sunni Islam. And if they don't convert to Sunni Islam, they must leave Afghanistan, otherwise they'll be killed. And soon after that declaration, Hazaras were massacred. So several thousand Hazaras were massacred in a northern city called Mazar-e Sharif, and he was the governor of that area. So obviously that's a very well-known quote that's attributed to the Taliban, and an explicit example of the fact that Hazaras were not seen as people who belonged to the nation or were, seen as citizens of Afghanistan. So alongside that, there were Taliban massacres in a district in central Afghanistan called Yakulang. So Hazara civilians were massacred there. And what was also discovered after the Taliban regime was removed when NATO came in Bamyan in central Afghanistan, it was a region that was known for having very famous ancient Buddhist statues of the Buddha, sorry. So in that region, they also destroyed the Buddha statues before they were removed from power. But what got found out in 2002 were that there were multiple mass graves. So what the local people had told the UN was that the Taliban, when they knew they were going to get removed from power, they came to the region and they massacred lots of Hazara civilians. So that was one of their last kind of bloodiest campaigns against Hazaras. So unfortunately, that's, we're talking about recent history. So a lot of people have lived through that. So when the events were happening last summer, when the Taliban were taking all the different provinces, and then when they came to Kabul in August and they captured Kabul at the end, it really signaled to people, Hazara people specifically, that, this means that we're going to go back to how things were in the 1990s. And in the beginning, the Taliban did say, we're changed. We're not like the Taliban in the 1990s. But a lot of people didn't believe that. And the people who were the people who didn't believe that basically turned out to be correct. So what we've seen since last summer when the Taliban came back is that Hazaras have been displaced from one of their provinces called Daikundi province. So the Taliban members have been going to Daikundi province and removing Hazaras from their homes. Also in the northern area called in Balkhab district, they went there. There was an offensive. They claimed it was to remove a Hazara commander, but after they'd removed him, they were still displacing many Hazara civilians. And when international aid organizations tried to deliver food and other aid to the region, the Taliban wouldn't let it pass and they wouldn't allow them to help the local Hazara population. And alongside that, Amnesty International has reported that the Taliban has engaged in targeted attacks against Hazaras last year and this year. There have been targeted attacks against Hazara men and women and even children. And then the other thing that's continued, this is something that was happening even before the Taliban took over, which was what we talked about, the targeted attacks since 2015. So the targeted attacks have continued. So the most major ones against Hazaras were one in April this year at a boys' school in Kabul. And then again in September this year at a girls' tuition center, between 80 to 100, even over 100 civilian casualties probably. So the targeted attacks have continued. But one of the problems we face now is because the Taliban is really engaging in a media censorship campaign. It's really hard to know when there's an attack, how many people have been injured. So, for example, the attack in September against the girls' tuition center, the Taliban was saying something like only 6 to 9 people were killed, but people who lost relatives who could gather the numbers from going to the hospitals were saying it's 80 people have been killed or even more. So on top of the fact that targeted attacks are continuing, now it's even harder to actually verify the information and know what's happening. And sadly, one other thing that the Taliban have been doing, which as far as I'm aware, the previous governments weren't doing, is they prevent local community members and family members from donating blood at hospitals in the aftermath of attacks. So every time there's an attack, the local community like to go and help in any way they can. And one of the ways that's done is through blood donation campaigns. So there's been video footage of in the aftermath of several attacks in the last few months that the Taliban beat people up who are waiting outside hospitals to go in to give blood donations. So unfortunately, yeah, there's nothing really to show that they've changed. If anything, things are just as bad, if not worse. But we can't even get much accurate information about what's happening to Hazaras, and not just Hazaras, activists, women who are journalists, people who were involved in civil society. It's just so hard to know what's happening on the ground right now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really unfortunate situation, and we express solidarity with folks from Hazara community. Now, as somebody who has been traveling to Pakistan and Jammu and Kashmir, especially in Jammu and Kashmir in Punj, what was surprising to you, or what really caught your eye in terms of what you thought and what really actually is on the ground?
Yeah.
Rabia, if I can ask, I mean, if I can add this question, that can you tell us about your family when you have migrated from Punj to UK, and what's about your experience in Punj?
Yeah, of course. So my family, so my maternal side, they all migrated in the early 1970s. So we've been based in the UK for about that side of the family for about 5 decades now. My dad, he came in the early 80s, initially as a student, and has stayed on. In terms of the experiences there, it's been when I was younger, it was mostly just family trips to visit, like my grandmother who lived in Punj. But since that time, I've been we used to go every 2 years, so I've had a regular contact with the region. But I think the thing that really has stood out to me, it's something I had been informed about, but I've also noticed more, is the kind of level of independence of the women there and educational attainment. So one thing I've noticed is, for example, how many women are out and they're breadwinners for families and are actually studying at university, for example. And for me, I had assumed that this was some recent phenomenon, but I was actually informed that specifically in Punj, female education goes back quite a long time. So that was very interesting to me to learn about the kind of promotion of education of the wider population in the area. So even learning from my own family about my grandmother getting educated. She was born in the 1920s and then became a teacher. So that's something that was really struck by, kind of, coming from the context that I do and the environment I do, not really knowing so much about the dynamics on the ground, but then actually learning about this history and tradition. So I think that's something that I have been really, really impressed by to learn about. One thing I would add, and obviously it reflects on me as well, also unfortunately, is the issue of language. I think it's really important to acknowledge. In recent years, there's been more of a prevalence of Urdu and English speaking among the youth. And as someone myself who's not a Pahari speaker, I do worry about the future of the language. For a very long time, Pahari was an oral language. So the kind of need for our community to preserve our native language, because in one generation that's diminished so much. So it's only going to be a few decades where we could find ourselves in a position where Pahari is something we know about, but very few of us can speak it. So that was just something also that to see how the language usage has also diminished in the region. And obviously, I'm very guilty of that myself as someone who can't speak it. So the need to really preserve our language, because we're talking about identity, history, culture, all these things. Language is a very, very important component of that. So really, the need for our youth, it's amazing what they're doing in terms of education and social mobility, but also the need to maintain our culture and our heritage through our language.
सॉरी, जो क्विक क्लैरिफिकेशन, आप पुंछ से मुराद आपकी इंडियन साइड पुंछ है या पाकिस्तानी साइड पुंछ है?
Pakistani side, but based on my politics, I don't really associate with either country. Punch, the region itself is divided between the two countries, and
Two countries, yeah, and you belong to basically from Rawalakot.
Yeah, that's the area my family are from. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, the point about language is brilliant, and again, I mean, I hope because that question, I mean, I see some responsibility at a household level, right? But I think the bigger responsibility lies at the state level and how to preserve, because the incentives are structured in a way that people have to maybe learn Urdu or English, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why. So fair point. I mean, and last point is about, like, have you ever thought of maybe studying Jammu and Kashmir in the future, or any plans?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that was said to me a lot in the first year of the PhD. Why are you not doing it on your own, region or community, from our own people? I have a fascination, like I have, even the whole time as a student, as much kind of academic literature I can find to educate myself, because my own learning started in like my late teens. For a very long time, I didn't know so much about the region myself. So this happened quite late in my own life. But I would be interested, but I just feel like I don't know how, because of the emotional connection to the region. I think I would find it quite difficult, to be honest. I think I can't disentangle those two areas. So I think I'd find it very difficult to do that, as much as it would be very interesting and fascinating, I think. But maybe something to do with like culture and the ethnic diversity, again, linking to what I've done before. I find that very, very fascinating, especially kind of some of our understudied communities. Could see if that goes anywhere in the future. But yeah, I think for the time being, my area of focus is the one I'd probably be sticking with.
Okay, and
you guys have actually elected the first Asian Prime Minister, and if I can notice that 1.5 million Kashmiris, we call that diaspora, they are living in UK. तो ये किस हद तक एक होप है वहाँ पे जो डायस्पोरा है उनके लिए, और अगर वो पॉलिटिकल जो वहाँ का प्रोसेस है उसमें इमर्ज हों, पॉलिटिकल प्रोसेस में पार्टिसिपेट करें, तो उनके लिए कितनी बड़ी होप है कि वो यूके जैसे मुल्क को रन कर सकते हैं और वहाँ से फिर वो पूरी दुनिया में एक इन्फ्लुएंशियल अपना किरदार भी अदा कर सकते हैं?
Yeah, so obviously it's a very big diaspora community. So again, I feel I can only really speak for myself. So there are a few things. Unfortunately, we're talking about the first Asian prime minister, which is obviously a very big deal in relation to representation. But we have, I think, even now, I think we have close to a dozen Kashmiri origin members of parliament in the UK parliament. So in that sense, unfortunately, in terms of the Kashmir issue, they've done very little. They've been very good at certain other issues, but in terms of actually standing up for the Kashmiri cause, there's been very little that's been done. So in that sense, I don't know how the political arena can really be. Obviously it can be utilized in a beneficial way, but it would need us to have people participating in the political process who do want to bring this issue to give it a central focus. So unfortunately, that's not happened yet, and there's nothing to show historically that it's happened. So it would need like a new generation of kind of politically motivated people who do really want to not only serve their country, the country they were born and brought up in, but also do something to help the Kashmiri cause, which hasn't happened yet. But in terms of the wider issue, the wider possible implications, it depends on how you see it. For some people, this is a really important milestone. We have our first Asian prime minister, our first non-Christian prime minister, Rishi Sunak, being of a Hindu background. For me, I don't view it as positively as some other people view it, because I think representation, for me, I perceive this as superficial representation. If you see the party he's aligned with, if you've seen the people he's brought in, I don't see this as actually helping, say for example, minority communities and people of Asian background. There's nothing to show that it will be beneficial in that way. If anything, this is possibly beneficial for our right-wing government to maybe engage in even more harsh policies that affect minority communities and say, it's being done by someone who is a minority, so now you can't complain. And the kind of most key example of that is our Home Secretary, who's our migration minister, basically. So he brought in a lady called Suella Braverman. She's she's Kenyan Mauritian background, but her heritage goes back to India. And she said some very, very toxic and harsh things towards refugee and migrant populations in the very short time that she's been in that position. So the fact that we have someone like her in a senior position in the government, for me, that's very worrying. So I feel like the representation issue is unfortunately going to be misrepresented. We're going to have people with very people of migrant and minority backgrounds who prop up very right-wing discourses being used to justify it further. So, there was a potential for this being seen in a different way, but unfortunately, I think the events of the last few days have shown that it will probably go in a direction that's not very beneficial for migrant, minority, and diaspora communities, unfortunately.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Rabia, for your time. And इसके साथ ही हमारा ख़वातीन हज़रात प्रोग्राम इख्तिताम पज़ीर होता है। नेक्स्ट वीक आपके साथ फिर शामिल होंगे। और अगर आप कोई भी अपने इस प्रोग्राम में अपने कोई इनपुट देना चाहते हैं, कोई सवालात रखना चाहते हैं, तो काइंडली हमें अपने सवालात पहले इनबॉक्स कर दीजिए। हम आपके सवालात को भी अपने मेहमानों के सामने रखेंगे। इसी के साथ आज का प्रोग्राम इख्तिताम पज़ीर होता है। अल्लाह हाफ़िज़।